Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today, I will be discussing my thoughts on R. Scott Bakker's Prince of Nothing trilogy. I recently finished The Thousandfold Thought, book 3 of the Prince of Nothing trilogy. And I do have some thoughts. However, I will keep them spoiler-free in this video. But I will be in a spoiler-filled discussion on the Prince of Nothing trilogy, particularly The Thousandfold Thought, with Jimmy from the Fantasy Network and Joanna and Raf Blutaxt on his channel. So do check out that discussion if you are interested in a spoiler-filled chat, ramble, all kinds of, I'm sure we will have lots of things to say about this trilogy. We've had the previous two discussions already on the first two books. The first discussion was on my channel, the second was on Joanna's, and the third, as I said, will be on Raf's channel. So please do check that out if you're interested. But here are my non-spoiler thoughts. I will most certainly be reading the rest of the second Apocalypse series. Bakker's writing is just too impressive for me not to want to continue. It is apocalyptic. I'm just deeply impressed with his exploration of themes, his vivid descriptions, his grasp of human nature, although it is certainly presented in a certain light, which I will discuss momentarily, and his extremely skillful prose. You have in this trilogy a holy war that borrows a lot from the First Crusade and adds some outrageously epic magic and a good dose of philosophy. It is, as I said, apocalyptic, it is grim, it is bleak, and yet it is also nuanced and evocative. It is even occasionally beautiful. And I would recommend it. I would definitely recommend it with a very large caveat. And that caveat is there is a lot of sexual violence. There is a lot of sexual violence in the Prince of Nothing trilogy. I don't know about the rest of the second Apocalypse series, but I'm assuming that will continue to be the case, but there is just a lot of sexual violence. I cannot emphasize that enough. And it even is to the point where not only is it, I would say, somewhat traumatizing, but it even gets a bit tedious, the amount of sexual violence in here. But it is part of the presentation of humanity that Bakker is making. I do not in any way think that Bakker is a misogynist or anything like that. He is using this in a way, I think, to make a point about humanity, and take that as you will. But I do believe that it is important to warn readers about that aspect of this trilogy. And to actually continue with that very unflattering view of humanity, basically it reminds me a lot, and this may sound strange to you at first, but it reminds me a lot of the view of humanity that we see in Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. We are essentially very corrupt and dirty and gross and grotesque, and we are self-centered and vain and hypocrites. And at the risk of being somewhat indelicate, I will mention a phrase that Bakker uses more than once in this, certainly in The Thousandfold Thought. He might have even used it earlier in the trilogy. But the phrase, and I do apologize for the indelicacy here, but it really does, I think, encapsulate the view of humanity that Bakker puts forward here. And the phrase is unwashed anuses. Yes, that is a phrase that he uses more than once. In fact, I would have been okay with maybe one or two unwashed anuses, but there are hordes of unwashed anuses in this trilogy. I mean, sweet Sejanus, somebody please bring this holy war some toilet paper, or maybe a few hundred porta potties with some bidets installed in them or something. But joking aside, it is a very bleak view of humanity, and it is most certainly emphasizing our, if I can put it this way, animal nature, although I think in some ways that's more or less an insult to animals. But let's get into some of the themes. The lack of free will. The lack of free will is something that Bakker, I think, puts forward in this trilogy. And I hesitate to ascribe the views of characters within the trilogy to the author, but it just seems so consistently put forward the idea that we essentially are deluding ourselves if we believe that we are making big decisions about our destiny. And we simply do not have as much free will as we think we do. Another one that is very much related to this, deluding ourselves to the fact that we don't have free will, is our prejudices, our limited vision due to our self-centeredness and our lack of empathy. And this self-centeredness is very much linked to the false narratives, or again, the societal-wide delusions that hold our societies together. And they also engender, I mean, that's a positive, right? That we have these narratives in our society, about myths about our society that hold us together, that give us a common identity. But unfortunately, the other side of these narratives is that they do engender a lot of hatred for other people. At least historically, they certainly have. And holy war is kind of an example of hatred for other people. And assuming that one's own view is holy or better or superior, one's worldview is somehow valid while other ones are false and invalid. And it's the idea that I am chosen. This is a phrase that Bakker essentially mocks in this trilogy. I am chosen, I am special, I am right. And of course, you can see where that sentiment would certainly be at the heart of a holy war. Whether or not the characters actually believe it, maybe some do. So maybe some do believe they're chosen, and others use the idea of being chosen as an excuse to get what they want. Regardless, it is an act of profound selfishness to persecute others on the basis of one's own righteousness or rightness. And this is something that Bakker explores very deftly. He is a gifted author, and he attacks the notion of certainty. Certainty is something that you just be on the lookout for if you read this trilogy, because the idea of certainty is false. It is based on lies that we tell ourselves. And Bakker exposes this so thoroughly in the Thousandfold Thought, especially, but throughout the trilogy. Just does a very skillful job while emphasizing our animal nature. He uses the comparison to apes many times throughout the trilogy. We are compared to apes and creatures that we consider to be lesser than ourselves, that are less sophisticated than we are. So the characters, let's talk about those a little bit. Now, they are pretty much a very broken crew. Either they're broken or they're exploitative. It feels like almost all the characters, if not all, in the Prince of Nothing trilogy are either predators or victims, or a combination of the two. But really, there's not much in between there. And again, that's emphasizing our lack of empathy. And so it's really hard to root for these characters, honestly. It's like almost all women, by the way, are on the victim side of this more than on the predator side, which is very sad because it is a very misogynist society. And there are particular characters that are used horribly over and over and over again. And not all women, but a lot of women in that sense. And it is actually very hard to, at least I found it to be hard to love these characters, to root for them. They simply evoke pity and disgust and horror. And some of that horror might even stem from the fact that they are recognizable at times. And so that makes it unpleasant, but I think a challenge that is important for a talented author like Bakker to undertake. In terms of the setting, I mentioned the First Crusade, and the trilogy takes a lot of its vibe from the First Crusade. So it would be actually very helpful for someone to be knowledgeable about the First Crusade before reading the Prince of Nothing trilogy, but not essential. And there is also a backdrop that Bakker creates here that consists of thousands of years of history and mythology and false narratives and a mysterious past. There's a much vaster narrative that lurks behind the present of the Holy War. That is the, at least on the surface, the reason for the trilogy. So it's a pretty masterfully portrayed setting. And as I say, a lot of the cultural vibes come from the time of the First Crusades. You have certain cultures that are very reminiscent of the Normans, who were the backbone of the First Crusade. And then you have the Normans, who were essentially somewhat Frenchified and dignified Vikings. They were barbarians at heart who had taken on a veneer of culture. And then you also have a more ancient civilization that is very reminiscent of the Byzantine Empire. And of course, you have a region that is much more reminiscent of the Middle East, or what we call the Middle East in the West, and the various cultures there. And there's an array of cultures there. It's not just one culture. Now, in terms of the magic, this is something that I really was blown away by in Bakker's writing. There are these various schools, and they are rivals, but they are also collectively looked down upon, scorned by the mainstream society, the religious establishment, as it were. So they live a very precarious existence. And while some of these magic wielders are incredibly powerful, they are also very vulnerable by a certain inclusion that Bakker makes. And I think that was a very smart thing to do. Otherwise, this incredible, epic, massive scale magic would have been pretty much invincible. But the magic users are vulnerable in a very crucial way, and I think that was a very clever touch on Bakker's part. But it's really cool. There are some epic, just huge, vast uses of magic in this trilogy that are just mind-blowingly cool. So, in terms of the pacing, this is an interesting one because there are a lot of moments of introspection. And there's actually a lot for a modern fantasy. There's a lot of exposition. Bakker's not afraid to put his, philosophical wanderings in the narrative. And I think for a lot of people that might slow down the pace a little too much. I did not mind it at all because I think I appreciated that he was trying to put forward some important themes. The stuff I was mentioning earlier about humanity and our vanity and our delusions. So he's at pains to explore this very thoroughly, and I enjoyed it. But I do think that a lot of readers would find it to be a bit boring at times. But when he does action, it goes fast. I mean, the last couple hundred pages of the Thousandfold Thought really did start rolling for me. Although I'll be honest, it was a bit tedious probably in the middle of it. And so I did get to the point where I was a little frustrated and wanted things to move a little bit faster in the Thousandfold Thought, which is why probably the second book, The Warrior Prophet, is my favorite of the three. But it was never in question that I would finish this book. I mean, I don't often give up on a book, and Bakker's just too skilled for me to do that. So slow at times, but when he gets to the action, boy, it does move, and you're going in between all these different perspective characters and just big things happening all at once. So a pretty great ending to the trilogy, I will say, with a very ending that will, I think, haunt a lot of readers. So those are my thoughts on the Prince of Nothing trilogy, at least as spoiler-free as I can make them. I am really excited to talk with Raph and with Jimmy and Joanna to share my thoughts and hear theirs, and I think it'll be a very interesting experience. I'm very happy that I have read the Prince of Nothing trilogy, and I am looking forward to eventually, not right away, but eventually I will be reading the rest of the Second Apocalypse series. So until I see you next time, be good, be safe, and remember to always keep turning the page.